North Vietnamese troops had violated the Paris Peace Accords and renewed their assault on the South. It was clear the Republic of Vietnam would fall. In April of '75, North Vietnamese troops approached the southern capital of Saigon. President Gerald Ford ordered all U.S. troops and citizens out of the country.
To permit the movement of refugees to the area of their choice.
And on April 29th, Armed Forces Radio began playing White Christmas to signal an evacuation was underway.
I'm dreaming of a white Christmas.
Captain Gerald Berry was assigned to rescue U.S. Ambassador Graham Martin. The mission evolved into an 18-hour day of shuttling people to an armada of ships waiting in the South China Sea. And as Berry flew toward the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, he could see enemy tanks approaching the city.
Personally, I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed that the United States of America is being humiliated and is leaving an area that we had come to defend. And we've been defeated. Yes, we've chosen to leave, but we've chosen to leave because it's no longer defendable with the resources that we have chosen to commit and the limits that we have put on our involvement in South Vietnam.
There is a creature alive today who has survived millions of years of evolution without change, without passion, and without logic. It lives to kill. A mindless eating machine. It will attack and devour anything. It is as if God created the devil and gave him jaws. This is Universal's extraordinary motion picture version of Peter Benchley's best-selling novel, Jaws.
I just found out that a girl got killed here last week, and you knew it. You knew there was a shark out there. You knew it was dangerous, but you let people go swimming anyway.
You yell barracuda. Everybody says, huh? What? You yell shark. We've got a panic on our hands on the 4th of July.
Is it true that most people get attacked by sharks in 3 feet of water, about 10 feet from the beach?
What we are dealing with here is a perfect engine, an eating machine.
We're not only going to have to close the beach, we're going to have to hire somebody to kill the shark.
Bad fish. But I'll catch him and kill him.
Did you hear your father? Out of the water now!
This shark, swallow you whole. You're gonna need a bigger boat.
That's a 20-footer.
25. 3 tons of them.
I see a little silhouette of a man. Scaramouche, will you do the fandango? Thunderbolt and lightning, very, very frightening me. Galileo, Figaro. Magnifico! I'm just a poor boy, nobody loves me. He's just a poor boy from a poor family. Spare him his life from this monstrosity. Easy come, easy go, will you let me go? Bismillah. No, we will not let you go. Let him go. Bismillah. We will not let you go. Let him go. Bismillah. We will not let you go. Let me go. We'll not let you go. Let me go. We'll not let you go. Let me go. Oh, mamma mia, mamma mia. Mamma mia, let me go. Beelzebub has a devil put aside for me. For me. For me. matters. Anyone can see. Nothing really matters. Nothing really matters to me.
Glass Onion. John Lennon.
Everybody, welcome to episode 114 of Glass Onion on John Lennon, and this is John Lennon in 1975, part 1 of 2. Now, seasoned listeners to the show will know that this is part of a series I've been doing, John Lennon in, and then a particular year. The earliest one we've done is 1962, and we've done 1980. In fact, we did briefly mention the year we're looking at today. It was in a show I did with Kit O'Toole. I think it was about 6.5 years ago, I want to say, in the early days of the podcast. But I take a particular year, and part 1 is the year itself and the non-Lennon / Beatles events and other business. And then part 2 is Lennon / Beatles. In the 60s, in the years of the 60s, of course, there'd be a lot of Beatles in with the Lennon stuff. This is a bit different because we're covering 1975, which is obviously part of the solo years of John Lennon. Now, listeners to one of my other podcasts, Life and Life Only, will probably guess why I'm covering this year, 1975, in 2025, and that's because it was the year I was born, and I notched up my half century back in August. And I really thought, I must do this year. This is the perfect time. In the part 1s, where I look at the years, a theme has emerged, which is that the world progresses, but then also destroys. So it's a mixture of progress and destruction each year. I tend to think of it as 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That might be a bit generous. One of my former guests, I think I know who it was, but I won't name him, said it was more like 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. You could argue about that, but that theme is interesting. Now, the format, if you haven't heard one of these shows before, we look at world events and then births and deaths, trying to find ones that have some maybe Beatles connection, Lennon connection, or just connection to something that I'm interested in personally. Films of the year, then albums and singles of the year, and then finally Lennon / Beatles events. I'm not sure if I always merge the film and music events in with the world events. I think I've done a mixture, and then births and deaths the same. I'll be merging today the film and music, births and deaths, in with the general stuff. But it's interesting to contrast them in terms of importance. And this is something that has come up before, that when you look at Beatles events, I think it was when we were doing 1965, I have a memory of saying, in music, the day of the recording of Help or Like a Rolling Stone, Bob Dylan, or Satisfaction, Rolling Stones, that is important in its own context. But if it's compared to a massive escalation of ground troops into Vietnam, American ground troops, then it's not important. So it's a good lesson in what is important and what is importance, in fact. So you can have a think about that while I'm going through these, because you'll find some quite interesting contrasts. Some events are about life and death, obviously the births and deaths, but within the events as well, because Vietnam is still going on at this point, for some of the year anyway. And some things might be trivial to the world at large, but like I say, they're important in their own context, in their own bubble, if you like. Anyway, without further ado, we've got a lot to cover, so let's just crack on. Going through some of the world events chronologically. I won't be commenting on all of these because there's just too much. And this is supposed to be the easy part of the 2 parts, because the second one with all the John Lennon stuff, there's so much to cover, and I'll be adding clips inevitably. I haven't planned to add any clips to this one. while I'm talking, but you never know. While I'm editing it, something might come up. So, January the 1st, Watergate scandal. John N. Mitchell, H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman are found guilty of the Watergate cover-up. January the 8th, 3 Led Zeppelin concerts at Madison Square Garden sell out in a record 4 hours. This was really Led Zeppelin in their pomp, mid-70s. January 14th, the USSR repudiates its trade agreement with the United States, primarily due to US laws that imposed conditions on trade benefits related to Soviet emigration practices. This action surprised many US lawmakers and was seen as a significant setback in US-Soviet relations during the Cold War. Now, just to say that the more I look at it, the more that world events and particularly geopolitics just seem to be inextricably linked to commerce and the trading of various things, including, of course, weapons. January 20th, in Hanoi, North Vietnam, the Politburo approves the final military offensive against South Vietnam. On the same day, work is abandoned on the 1974 Anglo-French Channel Tunnel scheme. The 50-kilometre tunnel was finally opened in 1994. So there's the progress and destruction on the same day there. February 11th, Margaret Thatcher defeats Edward Heath for the leadership of the opposition UK Conservative Party. Thatcher, 49, is Britain's first female leader of any political party. These are my notes. She'd have a massive impact on the world in conjunction with Ronald Reagan, and this was the era of the neoliberal policies. It's a very, very complicated story, but I think we have mentioned this on the show before. I think something happened in the 80s that really has been solidified, and partly it was the rise of corporations. Of course, they've been rising in the years before that, but the idea that there was too much government, so we should let free trade and the corporations almost run the world in a way, economically at least. Now, jumping forward to March the 1st, Australian television switches to full-time colour. Now, I did have a look at a couple of other stats to do with colour television. Now, there's various years here given for the UK, but 1976 was when colour became absolutely predominant, but black and white TV didn't actually finish until 1985, and it was 1986 in the USA. I was quite surprised how late that was. March the 2nd, Los Angeles police make a routine traffic stop that turns out to be Paul McCartney and his wife Linda. Linda is arrested for having 170 to 225 grams, 6 to 8 ounces of marijuana in her pocketbook. That's a fairly hefty chunk. One of the reasons I mention that is not to shame Paul and Linda, but because I've just finished reading the Howard Soons book, Fab, An Intimate Life of Paul McCartney. It's nearly 600 pages, but Paul has obviously had a very long, very rich, along a winding road, really, of a life, you might say. I very much enjoyed the book. There were just a few quibbles, there were quite a lot of errors, and it was just a silly thing that he kept doing was he kept referring to Linda as Linda, but also Lynn on the same page, and then Ringo was Richie, but then also Ringo, again, sometimes on the same page, sometimes on the same paragraph. It's a trivial thing, isn't it? But anyone who listens to podcasts will know that, you know, you can be enjoying a podcast and then the host will pronounce a name wrong and keep doing it, and it just, you start to think, oh, please, can you just get it right? You know, it's so silly because he obviously put a lot of work into this book, and I really enjoyed it. In fact, so much that I'm going to read you some of the notes I made. Sometimes when I read a long book, I do find myself writing notes. I have a kind of a diary online. It's not the kind of woke up at 9 o'clock, had cornflakes for breakfast diary, but it's just thoughts and insights that I have at various times. So I've written some notes. I'll just read these for you. The book's divided almost perfectly into Paul's life up to the end of the Beatles in 1970, and then what is really his solo career. Wings clearly never close to being a band of equals. Just a quick mention for Sam Wiles of Paul or Nothing. I'll put in the show notes Howard Soons' appearance on Sam's show. Sam could be described as the McCartney to my Lennon. In fact, I think he described us as that because we did a few swapcasts a few years ago. Howard Soon sees a change in Macca post-Beatles, who seems more arrogant, stingy with money, and with no one to apply quality control with his music. He also finds his lyrics consistently weak, including Ram, and I do agree with that. I have very different feelings about Ram from what seems to be the consensus now. And Sam and I did discuss that a few years ago. And Soons is also not always kind to Linda, who seems to be simply on Team Paul most of the time. At the same time, you realise it hasn't been easy being Paul. Having said that, he chooses to keep himself constantly in the public eye, whereas someone like George chose the opposite option, and he's the one that got attacked, as in physically attacked, not attacked by the media. I found myself making a lot of notes on just the 1980s section. The gist is that the popular perception of the real Paul, to those who study and work with him, is very different to the Paul propaganda that the unthinking masses largely don't care to question. These are why these are private notes, you see, not for public consumption, apart from now. The Press to Play episode is a good case in point regarding the problem with Paul. Macca writes some tunes quite effortlessly with Eric Stewart, charming him with his simplicity in the process. However, Stewart doesn't realise the songs won't be refined to reach a high standard in the studio. Instead, Paul will smoke joints in secret, in inverted commas, and basically tinker with the album for 18 months. After Lennon's death, the only collaborator alive who can tell Paul something like the truth in the 80s is George Martin. I put here Harrison doesn't work with McCartney at this point, and Ringo is probably too easygoing. And George Martin was exhausted after doing 2 albums on the trot with McCartney. That's Tug of War and Pipes of Peace. What comes across from this book is that Paul is essentially a decent person who's lived with a kind of fame that is pretty toxic. He can be verbally aggressive and prone to bouts of spontaneous rage when he's wronged. He rides the London Tube, but by the late 80s had already built up his Sussex estate to nearly 1,000 acres, 3 times the size of Hyde Park. The last few chapters were all about the very messy Heather Mills period, with lots of details made public thanks to the judge's very long final divorce ruling being published for the world and the rabid media to see. She really does seem to be a bit of a fantasist, though a gutsy woman for sure, and it seems that there's a dark side to Paul that can come out under stress. I put in brackets, which one of us doesn't have a dark side? Paul had just met Nancy Chevelle when this book was published, and that seems to have been a success. The fact that he's finally let his hair go grey might suggest less insecurity, so I was left wondering what makes a person. Is it all about his mother's death with Paul, or is the root of his complexity or anyone else's something we can never know? He's certainly not a monster, but one of the contributors did suggest that a person as famous as him is almost inevitably going to do monstrous things. Yeah, not much to add there. Like I say, I think the central point, although a lot of that does sound negative, he's a man, he's a human being, and he's flawed. And that's the same with all of us. We're all human and we're all flawed. Anyway, very interesting book. Big recommendation for that. Right, moving on. March the 9th, construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System begins. That's an oil transportation pipeline spanning Alaska. March 13th, Vietnam War again. The South Vietnam president, whose name I can't pronounce, orders the Central Highlands evacuated. This turns into a mass exodus involving troops and civilians, the so-called Convoy of Tears. April 4th, Vietnam War again. The first military Operation Baby Lift flight, C-5A 80218, crashes 27 minutes after takeoff, killing 138 on board. 176 survived the crash. Now, I had no idea about Operation Baby Lift or this event. Operation Baby Lift was a mass evacuation of children from South Vietnam to the United States and other Western countries at the end of the Vietnam War. Yes, you'd have to think a lot of babies died in that crash, obviously. That sounds absolutely horrific. Now, there is a Lennon connection here, an unfortunate one, that Mark David Chapman, his killer, worked successfully for World Vision, which was, I think it was a Christian charity, with possibly some quite dodgy connections. I think David Whelan would be the man to ask for that. Worked successfully for World Vision with Vietnamese refugees at a resettlement camp at Fort Chaffee in Arkansas, after a brief visit to Lebanon for the same work. He was named an area coordinator and a key aide to the program director, David Moore, who later said Chapman cared deeply for the children and worked hard. Chapman accompanied Moore to meetings with government officials, and President Gerald Ford shook his hand. I think there may even be a picture of that. April 4th, Bill Gates and Paul Allen found Microsoft. Small detail, at this time known as Micro-Soft, not one word, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and released their Altair Basic interpreter. Microsoft becomes a registered trademark on November the 26th, 1976. April 7th, Ritchie Blackmore plays a final show with Deep Purple in Paris before quitting to form his own group, Rainbow. Deep Purple used to be one of my favourite bands. I still really like them. Probably prefer Sabbath and Led Zeppelin if we're talking about 70s hard rock. Probably prefer Deep Purple to AC/DC, but all those are good bands, or great bands. April 17th, the Khmer Republic surrenders when the communist Khmer Rouge guerrilla forces capture Phnom Penh, that's the capital of Cambodia, ending the Cambodian Civil War with mass evacuation of American troops and Cambodian civilians. The Khmer Rouge begins a forcible mass evacuation of the city and starts the Cambodian genocide. So another success for America there, helping Cambodia. April 25th, Vietnam War again. As the North Vietnamese army close in on the South Vietnamese capital Saigon, the Australian embassy is closed and evacuated, almost 10 years to the day since the first Australian troop commitment to South Vietnam. And then finally at the end of the same month, April 30th, very famous day in modern history, the fall of Saigon. The Vietnam War concludes as communist forces from North Vietnam take over Saigon, resulting in mass evacuation of the remaining American troops and South Vietnam civilians. As the capital is taken, South Vietnam surrenders unconditionally and is replaced by a temporary provisional government. Operation Frequent Wind was the final phase in the evacuation of American citizens and at-risk Vietnamese from Saigon before the takeover, as we said, by the North Vietnamese. More than 7,000 people were evacuated by helicopter from various points in Saigon. And note the similarity to the scenes at Kabul airport as the Americans evacuated Afghanistan, leaving the country in the hands of the Taliban. So a very, very similar situation, and quite depressing to think of the same thing basically happening nearly 50 years later. Obviously, it's not exactly the same. Afghanistan, Vietnam were not the same conflicts. Ken Burns' Vietnam whitewash documentary, there's no other word for it if you actually know about the Vietnam War. I've talked about that before, I think. Said something along the lines, the US doesn't get involved in wars in territories it doesn't understand, people who speak languages it doesn't speak. We'll never do that again, everybody. Don't worry. Sleep tight. The authorities are in control. May the 1st, Ronnie Wood debuts with the Rolling Stones, who announced their forthcoming North American tour by performing Brown Sugar from a flatbed truck on Fifth Avenue in New York City. June the 5th, the Suez Canal opens for the first time since the Six-Day War. That was the Arab-Israeli War in 1967. We talked about that briefly when we did a show about that year. July the 5th, Cape Verde gains independence after 500 years of Portuguese rule. Now, interesting, what do we think of when I say Cape Verde? What do you think of? Do you think about a territory gaining independence, or do you think of a trendy tourist destination? A very expensive tourist destination. August 1st, I sound like such a cynic, don't I? Maybe I'm in a bit of cynical mood today. August 1st, the Helsinki Accords, which officially recognise Europe's national borders and respect for human rights, are signed in Finland. August 4th, Robert Plant, that's the lead singer of Led Zeppelin, and his wife Maureen are seriously injured in a car accident while vacationing on the Greek island of Rhodes. The immediate future of Led Zeppelin is cast into doubt, as Plant will not recover for quite some time. This was part of a series of very dark and disastrous events which culminated for Led Zeppelin, I guess, with John Bonham's death in 1980. But there were all kinds of things that were happening, and some people have put it down to Jimmy Page's dabbling in the dark world of Aleister Crowley. There was also hard drugs going around the band, I think more with Page and Bonham than Robert Plant, but there was definitely heroin, and it all got very dark. August 14th, Antony Rotunno is born. August 24th, officers responsible for the military coup in Greece in 1967 are sentenced to death in Athens. The sentences are later commuted to life imprisonment. Now, Greece, 1967 Beatles fans, of course you know what I'm going to mention. The Beatles were thinking about buying one Greek island with 4 annexes, or maybe 4 separate islands to live on in the communal spirit. And there's a great, it's almost become now a pop video, the way this is done in the anthology. The footage of this is accompanied by the song Baby You're a Rich Man, or it's the other way around. It's quite an interesting choice, because obviously they were rich men who on a whim were going to buy an island in Greece, and on a opposite whim, I suppose, then decided against it. I remember reading something about Magic Alex and his family being something to do with that military coup, or having contacts. Don't know exactly. Everything about him's quite mysterious, isn't it? But Beatles connection there. Now, I think this is the same day. The London Hilton Hotel is bombed by the Provisional Irish Republican Army, Provisional IRA. 2 people are killed and 63 injured. Now, I think it was a year before we had the Guildford and Birmingham bombings and the subsequent miscarriages of justice that happened there. If you say Guildford 4 and Birmingham 6 to anyone in the British Isles of a certain age, they'll know what you're talking about. And there was a film, there was a book first and then a film called In the Name of the Father that covered the Guildford 4 case. Of course, miscarriages of justice don't happen anymore. Once again, the authorities are in control. 14 or 15 whole life sentences for Lucy Letby, who might end up being released next year. Not sure about that, but that's a distinct possibility. How they're going to explain that away, I've got no idea. Oh, sorry about that, Lucy. We'll see about that one. Here's a perfect example of what I was saying before about important events that are related to, let's say, violence and death and something relatively trivial. September 19th, Indonesia sends troops to Portuguese East Timor. There'll be more on that in a second, but on the same day, we get the first episode of Fawlty Towers.
You vicious bastard! Come on! Oh my God! I'm warning you, if you don't stop, I'll count to 3. 1, 2, 3, right! That's it! You've tried it on just once too often! Right! Well, don't say I haven't warned you! I've laid it on the line to you time and time again! Right! Well, this is it! I'm gonna give you a damn good thrashing!
Famously, there are only ever 12 episodes, 2 series. John Cleese and Connie Booth spent 6 weeks on each script. That was the John Cleese style. The magic of Monty Python, we've covered, still covering, in fact. There'll be an episode on Film Gold coming out around the time that this comes out, but recorded earlier with Luke Thompson. One of the magic things about Monty Python is that everything looks spontaneous, but the scripts are very, very carefully worked out, and Cleese was famous for spending a long, long time honing things to perfection. So we're coming up here with 50th anniversaries that have just happened. I'm recording this at the beginning of November, and it should be coming out probably mid-November. September 22nd in San Francisco, Sarah Jane Moore tries to assassinate US President Ford, but is foiled by the Secret Service. Now, I thought I knew a fair amount about the 70s in terms of politics, but I'd never heard of that President Ford had an assassination attempt. Of course, John F. Kennedy was assassinated, Ronald Reagan was shot, and there have been 2 attempts on the life of President Trump as well, recently. October the 1st, Muhammad Ali beats Joe Frazier in the Thriller in Manila. Now, on October the 1st this year, I watched the fight back again. Absolutely incredible. Highly surreal. It was 10 o'clock in the morning, something like that, in the Philippines. Incredibly hot. I don't think there was any air conditioning, and there were thousands of people packed into a fairly small auditorium. It was just outside Manila, I think, actually. I can recommend a documentary made. It's just called Thriller in Manila. Again, I'll put it in the show notes. Came out, I think it was 2007. I think it was shown on British TV at the beginning of 2008, but it's around that period. Of course, Ali and Frazier are no longer with us. Again, I'm going to sound like a terrible curmudgeon, but the idea that the modern era of heavyweight boxing is a classic era is really much more about the fact that we're living in a classic era of hype. And of course, you've got, with social media and so forth, you've got the means to create hype on a much larger scale than back in 1975. I think the Fury Wilder, the third fight, was a classic. And I think even the one we just had, Joseph Parker and Fabio Wardley, was a classic. A modern classic, let's say, or certainly a slugfest. But have a look at this fight, folks. It's on YouTube. Ali and Frazier. I'll put that in the show notes as well. An HD version. Just absolutely incredible. October 11th, Saturday Night Live premieres with guest host George Carlin. Now, a couple of Lennon connections here. Of course, George Carlin was on the Mike Douglas show in that wonderfully surreal week in early 1972 where John and Yoko were guest hosts. We did do a show about 1972, and I'm sure I've mentioned it since, that I was wondering whether Carlin talked to John and Yoko backstage. George Carlin wasn't quite what he became, he'd already had a kind of awakening through LSD and various other things. He looks like a bit of a hippie in that 72 show. He looks pretty cool. But then his real awakening would come later, and he would become, in his later years, in his 70s, basically, 60s and 70s, would become, I would say, almost a person whose jokes were incidental to the profound things he was telling you about the world, the truth of the world. I can feel like the show notes are going to get congested very quickly, but I must put a clip of... It's not a speech, it's a clip from one of his shows, but if you say to somebody the Owners of the Country clip of George Carlin, they might know what you're talking about.
Don't look for it. Be happy with what you got. Because the owners of this country don't want that. I'm talking about the real owners now. The big wealthy business interests that control things and make all the important decisions. Forget the politicians. The politicians are put there to give you the idea that you have freedom of choice. You don't. You have no choice. You have owners. They own you. They own everything. They own all the important land. They own and control the corporations. They've long since bought and paid for the Senate, the Congress, the state houses, the city halls. They got the judges in their back pockets. And they own all the big media companies, so they control just about all of the news and information you get to hear. They got you by the balls. They spend billions of dollars every year lobbying to get what they want. Well, we know what they want. They want more for themselves and less for everybody else. But I'll tell you what they don't want. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. That's against their interest. That's right. They don't want people who are smart enough to sit around the kitchen table and figure out how badly they're getting fucked by a system that threw them overboard 30 fucking years ago. They don't want that. You know what they want? They want obedient workers. Obedient workers. People who are just smart enough to run the machines and do the paperwork, and just dumb enough to passively accept all these increasingly shittier jobs with the lower pay, the longer hours, the reduced benefits, the end of overtime, and the vanishing pension that disappears the minute you go to collect it. And now they're coming for your Social Security money. They want your fucking retirement money. They want it back, so they can give it to their criminal friends on Wall Street. And you know something? They'll get it. They'll get it all from you sooner or later, because they own this fucking place. It's a big club, and you ain't in it.
Another connection, of course. John and Paul were apparently at home about a year later, or the following year at least, watching Saturday Night Live when they got the famous $3,000 offer from Lorne Michaels. But did that actually happen? That's the thing. Paul has intimated in recent years that, in fact, that didn't happen. So who the hell knows about anything? Take it all with a grain of salt, folks. Or a cellar of salt in some cases. Simon and Garfunkel would reunite on the second episode the following week, performing the Boxer Scarborough Fair and new collaboration My Little Town. Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel will feature in part 2 when we go through the Lennon events. October 16th, the Balibo 5 Australian television journalists are killed at Balibo by Indonesian Army Special Forces in the build-up to the Indonesian invasion of East Timor. I'll make a reference to later in the year, December 7th, Indonesian invasion of East Timor. The occupation continues until 1999, when UN peacekeepers take control, which they did until 2002. Now, this was another one of Henry Kissinger's greatest hits. I say that with heavy irony. There's a book and a documentary called The Trials of Henry Kissinger by the late Christopher Hitchens. If you think old Henry's just an old wily diplomat, think again. He lived to 100, which proves there's no justice in the world. Now, I think this is also on October the 16th. The last naturally occurring case of smallpox is diagnosed and treated, the victim being 2-year-old Rahima Banu in Bangladesh. Notice this theme continues, progress and destruction. And here's some more destruction of a slightly different kind. 29th of October, the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe, kills his first victim, Wilma McCann. I've studied that case quite extensively, and the book I'd recommend is called Wicked Beyond Belief. The audiobook is available online. Well worth listening to or reading if you get the print version. October 30th, Juan Carlos I of Spain becomes acting head of state after General Francisco Franco concedes that he's too ill to govern. His death on November the 20th effectively marks the end of the dictatorship established following the Spanish Civil War and the beginning of the Spanish transition to democracy. Juan Carlos is declared King of Spain on November the 22nd, reigning until his abdication in 2014. when King Felipe took over. I actually moved to Spain in 2014. Spain's development as a modern nation, not quite one of the big power players. There's a few countries that are a bit more powerful and have bigger economies than Spain, but it's developed from a rural country to a modern metropolis, I suppose. Certainly the big cities are metropolises, metropoli. Thanks, Alan Partridge. Its development has been very, very fast. October 31st, the Racial Discrimination Act takes effect in Australia. And also my mother's 28th birthday. She already had 3 children under her belt, or under her feet, perhaps is better by that point. November the 6th, the Sex Pistols play their first concert at St Martin's School of Art in London. Whatever you think about the Sex Pistols, and I really like them, they certainly had a big impact on British rock and roll. Still call it rock and roll, you can call it rock, perhaps. Obviously that's punk rock, but at the end of the day, for me, it's all rock and roll. November the 10th, by a vote of 72 to 35 with 32 abstentions, the United Nations General Assembly approves a resolution equating Zionism with racism. The resolution provokes an outcry among Zionists. It's repealed in 1991. November 11th, Angola becomes independent from Portugal and civil war erupts. I'm not sure if the civil war immediately followed from the independence, but how about that for just a statement about people? They look for their independence, but then there's a fight amongst themselves, and I'm not having Angolan people or Angola in that case. That can apply to lots of countries, and of course European colonial involvement in Africa is a long and horrific story, usually involving the mining of resources. On the same day in Australia, Governor-General of Australia, Sir John Kerr, controversially dismisses the Whitlam Labour government and commissions Malcolm Fraser of the Liberal/National Country Coalition as caretaker Prime Minister. Whitlam was the head of a reformist and socially progressive government. Now, if you do think in a conspiratorial way, or you have researched things, you will find a lot of this where you have a progressive government. Something will happen. The leader will be struck down because there are certain, again, business interests that do not want equality, and they don't want nationalisation of industries. Depends on the country, obviously. But my friend Paul recommended a podcast series to me a few years ago called The 11th. I'll put it in the show notes. Basically how to systematically take down a political threat. November 15th, the group of 6 industrialised nations, the G6 at that time, is formed and holds its first summit at the Château de Rambouillet in France. Rambouillet? That might be how it's pronounced. Now let's have a little quiz, shall we, folks? The G6 started as the G5. Can you name which 5 nations? I'll give you a few seconds. Okay, UK, USA, West Germany, France and Japan. Then Italy was added for the G6, and then finally Canada for the G7. November the 16th, beginning of the Third Cod War between UK and Iceland, which lasts until June 1976. The Cod Wars were a series of 20th century confrontations between the United Kingdom, with aid from West Germany, and Iceland about fishing rights in the North Atlantic. Each of the disputes ended with an Icelandic victory. Perhaps I should have said at the top of the show, but I'm basically getting all these events from Wikipedia. So, I don't know, take some again with a pinch of salt. But I hope I'm giving you an overall flavour of the year at least. November 25th, Suriname gains independence from the Kingdom of the Netherlands. So it's interesting through the 20th century seeing these countries gradually gaining independence from their colonial masters. December 2nd, in Laos, the Second Indochina War ends when the Communist Party of the Pathet Lao takes over Vientiane, that's the capital, and defeats, where I used to live in fact, and defeats the Kingdom of Laos, forcing King Sisavang Vatana to abdicate and creating the Lao People's Democratic Republic. This ends the Laotian Civil War with mass evacuation of American troops and Laotian civilians. That sound familiar? But effectively begins the insurgency in Laos, with the Pathet Lao fighting the Hmong people, royalists in exile, and the right wings. So again, civil war, whether coerced or not, seems to have been a feature of history. Invasions by larger powers, and then fighting amongst the peoples of the nation. Again, let me make it clear, I'm giving you superficial headlines for these dates. This is not exhaustive. I have covered geopolitics in more detail on Life and Life Only, one of my other podcasts. We're just skimming the surface here. Back to the relative triviality of rock and roll. December the 6th, The Who set the record for largest indoor concert at the Pontiac Silverdome, attended by 78,000 fans. Elvis Presley would perform before the biggest audience of his career at the same venue on the 31st. Here's a little detail. During the show, Elvis rips his pants on stage and has to leave to change. Now, on a serious note, I did do a show, obviously, with Ghosty a few years ago about John Lennon and Elvis, and most of my Elvis knowledge came from the Peter Guralnick 2-part book. It was around 1973 we kind of agreed that the rot was starting to set in. Elvis obviously died in 77, so there's a serious side to even just him ripping his pants. You know, his weight was ballooning. His main problem, though, was really prescription drugs, exhaustion, and I guess food addiction as well. December 25th, so Christmas Day 75, bassist Steve Harris forms Iron Maiden, drawing the name from a torture device mentioned in The Man in the Iron Mask. Yes, the Iron Maiden was one of the very, very nasty medieval torture methods. Of course, it's always cool to name your rock band after something horrific. Black Sabbath is another example. Just one more. Date unknown. South Australia becomes the first Australian state to decriminalise homosexual acts between consenting adults. Another Beatles connection there, of course. When we did the show in 1967, we talked about that same thing happening in the UK. And there's a Brian Epstein connection because he was homosexual, of course, and he died in that year. Right, let's have a look at births. Most of these people that I'm naming here will be familiar. It depends where you come from. There's a couple that might not be, and I think all these people that I'm going to name are still alive, so they all have turned 50 or are turning 50 this year. Mark Williams is a snooker player. He's part of the class of 92, which snooker fans will definitely have heard of. So he was born on March 21st. David Beckham was born on May the 2nd. Of course, David has just been knighted by King Charles. And he said, I'm so pleased. Me and Victoria are going to go home and celebrate tonight. Thanks very much, King. So yeah, Beck's half century and a knighthood this year. John Higgins, who's another of that class of 92. The most famous one of those, there's three of the class of 92, is coming up in a bit, and you'll definitely have heard of him, I think, if you live in, say, the British Isles. John Higgins and the musician Jack Johnson, May the 18th, they were born. Jack Johnson, for me, is synonymous with the years when I lived in Thailand, because you cannot get, there's nothing more synonymous, I think, with the beaches of Thailand. I did live on an island for 6 months, actually. It's called Koh Lanta, or Koh Lanta. It might be pronounced in England. And you can't get anything more than a Thailand beach than number one Bob Marley, maybe Ben Harper, but definitely Jack Johnson. It just fits the mood. I kind of went off him after a couple of albums because it just seemed very, very samey. But anyway, Russell Brand, who I used to believe in. Well, I still think some of the stuff he says is true, but his commercial motivations seem to be pretty obvious nowadays. 50 Cent, July the 6th. I mentioned that because he did a book with Robert Greene, which I mentioned on the show I did around my birthday this year on Life and Life Only. Jack White, who's a musician I respect a lot, formerly of the White Stripes, July the 9th. Liz Truss, July the 26th. She lasted 49 days as a Prime Minister, the shortest serving Prime Minister in British history, but she still lasted 5 more days than the legendary football manager Brian Clough did at Leeds. August 14th, Antony Rotunno. Oh, okay, again. Mark Ronson, September the 4th. He worked with McCartney. Quite well known. I think he's a DJ as well, but I know him as a producer. Sean Lennon, of course, October the 9th. Ronnie O'Sullivan, he's the most famous of the class of 92, December the 5th. Ronnie was asked to name his, I don't know if it was favourite sportsman or the sportsman he thought were the best, and one of the people he mentioned was Tiger Woods, who was born 25 days after Ronnie, December the 30th. Now, Tiger Woods, if you go back to 2009, was not quite 34 and already had 14 golf majors, just 4 behind Jack Nicklaus, and was basically certain to overtake that. But then he had a lot of trouble. He crashed his car, and the press got hold of stories of his adultery. With all that scandal, his game was obviously affected, and he's only won one major since then. So he's on 15, still 3 behind Nicklaus. But, I mean, he's still a golf legend for what he did up to 2009. Now, interestingly, I was just reading a bit more about that. A December 2009 study estimated the shareholder loss caused by Woods' affairs to be between $5 and $12 billion. So, yes, if you take that case, it's not just about the damage to his reputation. If you're a big player in the world, you know, you're a famous person, powerful person, that kind of fall from grace has massive financial ramifications. You almost can't avoid that. Okay, let's move to deaths. February 25th, Elijah Muhammad. I've got the birth dates here. I haven't actually got the age because it depends whether they had their birthday this year. But Elijah Muhammad, born in 1897, American Nation of Islam leader. Now, if you study the story of Muhammad Ali, and again, beyond just all the superficial, what a great guy he was and everything, you will find that he was almost certainly very much under the thumb of the American Nation of Islam, which were called the Black Muslims, although that was I think that was a press term. Almost certainly they killed Malcolm X because he spoke out against them. And one of the things he spoke out against was the fact that His Holiness Elijah Muhammad had impregnated various women, I think including some of his secretaries. Let's put it into context with the Beatles. If you think the Maharishi was a bit of a perv for making a pass at Mia Farrow or whoever it was, Elijah Muhammad was way worse, and I think Ali was majorly brainwashed. Not only that, but there's a book that's just come out about Sonny Liston, which alleges, and it's based on many years of research, suggesting that the Nation of Islam were actually holding Sonny Liston's wife and children to make him throw the second Ali fight. Now, I think Ali, Cassius Clay as he was then, won the first fight with Liston legitimately. We'd never seen a heavyweight who moved like a middleweight like Ali. But the second fight, I mean, you can make all kinds of excuses that it was, you can't see the camera angle, that it was a real punch. But if you look at that, there's no way that punch is knocking Sonny Liston out. So to me, there's no doubt that the second fight was thrown. And that could be the reason. March 15th, Aristotle Onassis, Greek shipping magnate, born in 1906. So Jackie Onassis, formerly Jackie Kennedy, formerly Jackie Bouvier, became a widow for the second time. April 3rd, Mary Ure. She was the actress wife of one of my favourite actors and a very compelling character, Robert Shaw. There's been 2 biographies of Robert Shaw. I've read the one called The Price of Success, which was written by his agent, and apparently the agent was a bit disgruntled because of certain things that happened while Robert Shaw was alive. So I'm not sure entirely how accurate that is, but it's a very entertaining book. Robert Shaw had just filmed Jaws, but this was in the period before Jaws came out. Came out in June, as you'll hear in a minute when we get to the films. Now, Robert Shaw and Mary Ure were both alcoholics, and they were both, possibly because of the alcohol, they were insomniacs as well. Couldn't sleep without taking lots of pills, and their marriage was in a very sorry state. Robert Shaw discovered his wife's body and had to film a scene. It wasn't Jaws, it was another film that came out this year, just 2 hours after discovering her body. I was sort of interested to see which scene that was, because it just seems the most incredible thing that someone has just discovered their wife dead and has to just immediately lock into filming this. But then I thought, that's really showing a bit of a morbid interest. I don't really want to see that. Anyway, yeah, Robert Shaw, a very interesting person and also a writer as well as an actor. April 24th, Pete Ham, Welsh singer-songwriter and guitarist. He was 27. I do know his age because he's an unfortunate member of the 27 Club. He co-wrote Without You for Nielsen and was a former squeeze of May Pang. So lots of Beatles connections. Pete Ham, of course, was in the band originally called the Ivies and then became Badfinger. And Paul McCartney wrote Come and Get It for them, which was featured in the Magic Christian film. On the night of 23rd of April 1975, Ham received a phone call from the United States telling him that all his money had disappeared. Later that night, he met Tom Evans and they went to the White Hart pub in Surrey together, where Ham drank 10 whiskies. Evans drove him home at 3 o'clock on the morning of the 24th of April. Ham hanged himself in his garage studio in Woking later that morning, 3 days shy of his 28th birthday. Tom Evans, the co-lead singer and songwriter for Badfinger, also died by suicide in 1983. So there's a massive air of tragedy around that band. May the 28th, Ezzard Charles, American boxer, former world heavyweight champion. He was in the Rocky Marciano era, just before Ali. June 29th, Tim Buckley, American singer-songwriter, born in 1947, the father, of course, of Jeff Buckley. August the 9th, Dmitri Shostakovich, composer. He was 68, died of a heart attack. I developed quite an interest in classical music in the last few years. I love listening to it. I have it on the radio. I wake up to it and I go to sleep to it, and it's very, very peaceful. There is some classical music that's quite aggressive, but I find that certainly most of them that's played on Radio 3 is a very, peaceful thing, a mellow thing to have on in the background while you're doing other stuff, such as going to sleep or waking up. November the 2nd, Italian director Pier Paolo Pasolini, brutally murdered in Ostia, which is just outside Rome. The crime was long viewed as a mafia-style revenge killing, one that was extremely unlikely to have been carried out by only one person. Just to mention Pasolini, his most famous film is one that I will mention when we get to the films in a second. He actually inspired Terry Jones and a couple of other members of Monty Python with the Life of Brian film, because they loved Pasolini. He did make some historical epics. He also made very challenging films, including the one I'm going to mention, which is his most notorious, which was actually released just 3 weeks after his death. Finally, in this section, Bernard Herrmann. It's pronounced Bernard in America. So if it's an American, I'll say Bernard. If it's a British person, I'll say Bernard. American composer, born 1911. He was mentioned in the 5-parter I did on Citizen Kane for Film Gold. Citizen Kane was his first gig as a film composer, and his final one was Taxi Driver, and he'd finished the recording of the Taxi Driver soundtrack the previous day. Let's move on to films. Now I'm going to start with the big daddy of this year, for me anyway, Jaws. First movie to earn $100 million in US and Canadian theatrical rentals. That's $100 million then, of course, setting the standard for future blockbusters. It would actually be superseded by Star Wars only 2 years later, but I think even fans of Star Wars and George Lucas as well would acknowledge that Jaws set that standard. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Who knows? Maybe that was the age of hype starting in earnest. Full-on hype. Obviously, films have been advertised in the past, but I think it turned a corner. Jaws, of course, is a great film. You know, there's lots of popcorn movies which are absolute rubbish that just get hyped into making a lot of money, but Jaws was not one of them. I'm just going to go fairly quickly through this list. I'm just going to mention the other ones that I would count as my favourites for this year. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. That was the big winner at the Oscars. Second of 3 films to win the Big 5 Oscars, which is Best Picture, Actor, Actress, Director, and then Screenplay, either original or adapted. Now, do you want to name the other 2, folks? Okay, I'll give you 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. It Happened One Night, which was a 1934 film, and then Silence of the Lambs in the early 90s. Dog Day Afternoon, which I reviewed with Scott on The Stinking Paws. The Man Who Would Be King, Michael Caine and Sean Connery. We mentioned that when we did the Michael Caine special for Film Gold. Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Reviewed that for Film Gold as well with Luke. Nashville, Robert Altman. Just reviewed another Robert Altman film from the previous year called California Split with Scott. It all connects. The other 2 I'd mention that I'd say are big favourites are Picnic at Hanging Rock, which is an amazing film, full of mysticism. That one's well worth checking out. And Barry Lyndon, which is quite an underrated Kubrick film. It doesn't have the excitement and the commercial appeal of other films, although, you know, you could argue 2001: A Space Odyssey doesn't either. But Barry Lyndon is a quite amazing film, and one of the things about it is that all the lighting came from candles, famously. You know, Stanley suffered for his art, but he made others suffer, let's be honest. Just read a fairly recent biography on him. That was last year, I think I read that. Very eye-opening. Some others worthy of mention: Deep Red, which is a Dario Argento film, part of the Giallo series. Diamonds, Now, this is a film which is not rated very highly at all, but that was the one that Robert Shaw was filming just after he discovered his wife's body. French Connection 2, which is a pretty good sequel to the original. Love and Death, that's Woody Allen. The Passenger, with Jack Nicholson and Maria Schneider. Maria Schneider was in Last Tango in Paris with Brando. We mentioned that. We did the Brando show on Film Gold a few years ago. That's a Michelangelo Antonioni film. I've never seen the Rocky Horror Picture Show, but in all my research for this year, I couldn't find anything else that had happened on the same day as my birth. The only thing I found was this. It was premiered in London on August the 14th, which endears the film to me. I should watch it at some point. And then we got Salo, or The 100 Days of Sodom. That's the Pasolini film that I alluded to earlier. 3 Days of the Condor. That had Robert Redford in. Robert Redford died, of course, recently. The film of Tommy, which is, I'd call it a kind of a glorious mess. There's something quite weirdly charming about that film, but it's a very flawed film. Ken Russell film, obviously based on Pete Townshend's rock opera for The Who. Shampoo with Warren Beatty, haven't seen that one. The Sunshine Boys, another one I haven't seen, with Walter Matthau. I mentioned that because that won a few Oscars, including one for Matthau. Walter Matthau was in The Taking of Pelham 123 with Robert Shaw. Another film we've reviewed, I think I did that with Scott again, Stinking Paws. Count of Monte Cristo, TV version with Richard Chamberlain as the Count, or Edmond Dantes. Donald Pleasance is one of the villains. Louis Jordan, Tony Curtis, good cast. And then Trevor Howard as Abbe Faria, who's the prisoner who teaches Dantes about the ways of the world. And finally, I always do this. Whenever we're reviewing a year of films, I always end with a Carry On film. Carry On Behind is one of the worst innuendo titles, of course, but one of the worst films as well, with a bit of a so bad it's good quality. Okay, let's have a look at the music of the year. Now, there's so many singles in any one year that, again, I've just cherry-picked a few, some of which have Beatles connections. Fame by David Bowie. Of course, John Lennon played on that. I think, did he get a writing credit? We'll mention that in part 2 when we get to the Lennon stuff anyway. Rhinestone Cowboy. Rhinestone Cowboy. Glenn Campbell. Lady Marmalade, a.k.a. Voulez-vous coucher avec moi? Now, there's a Lennon connection there we'll get to in part 2. That was by La Belle. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds by Elton John. Lennon connection that we would have covered if we'd done 1974. We haven't done that one yet, but obviously John was involved in Elton's recording under the pseudonym Dr. Winston O'Boogie. And in fact, they performed that, didn't they, at Madison Square Garden, the famous event where John came on very, very wired. Adrenaline, nerves, something else, who knows. They did Whatever Gets You Through the Night, which of course had recently gone to number 1, Lucy in the Sky, and then I saw her standing there. The song by an old estranged fiancé of mine called Paul. Listen to What the Man Said by Wings. That's one of theirs that I really like. You by George Harrison. That was the lead-off single for one of his albums, which I'll mention in a bit. Born to Run, Springsteen. Has anyone seen the new Springsteen biopic? On the last show, we didn't mention it, but Ghosty and I were talking about how it's very difficult to do good biopics. So I'd be interested to see eventually that Springsteen one. Please Mr. Postman by the Carpenters. Obviously that was covered by the Beatles with the Beatles album in 1963. I'm Not in Love by 10cc featuring Eric Stewart. It really does all connect, doesn't it? I mentioned the Paul McCartney book earlier, the Howard Soons one. Eric Stewart, of course, wrote some of the songs on Press to Play. Sailing, I Am Sailing, Rod Stewart. Divorce by Billy Connolly. The next song, I always call this Queen's Strawberry Fields Forever. I think Bohemian Rhapsody and Strawberry Fields Forever really are among the greatest singles because they're quite profound. They're obviously catchy in some sense. They're not as easily accessible as, say, I Saw Her Standing There or something like that, but they're epic, they're profound. So yeah, Bohemian Rhapsody was this year. Down, 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 Deeper and Down by Status Quo, who I definitely have a soft spot for. Lonely This Christmas, It'll Be Lonely This Christmas by Mud, with just a little bit of inspiration from Elvis Presley. Stand By Your Man, Stand By Your Man, Tammy Wynette. Now, here's a novelty that I'd never heard of. Mr. Jaws by Dickie Goodman. I'll just read a bit about this. This record is a parody of the 1975 summer blockbuster film Jaws, with Goodman interviewing the shark, whom he calls Mr. Jaws, as well as the film's main characters, Brody, Hooper, and Quint. Goodman makes full use of his practice of break-in music sampling. That means mixing spoken word comedy with music, in which all of the interview answers are lyrics from popular songs from that year. Now, I did see a list of all the popular songs. Not going to go through those now, but shall we hear a little bit? Why not?
We are here on the beach where a giant shark has just eaten a girl swimmer. Well, Mr. Jaws, how was it? Dynamite! And what did she say when you grabbed her?
Please, mister, please.
I know sharks are stupid, but what did you think when you took that first bite?
How sweet it is.
Mr. Jaws, before you swim out to sea, have you anything else to say?
Why can't we be friends? Why can't we be friends?
With me now is the local sheriff. Sheriff Brody, the shark will be back for lunch. What do you intend to do?
Do a little dance, make a little love, get down tonight.
Just arriving is oceanographer Matt Hooper. Sir, if someone is attacked by a shark, what should they do?
Do the hustle.
We are going aboard the fishing boat of Captain Quint. Captain, will you be able to catch this giant shark?
I will.
Thank you, Captain. Captain, when you catch one of these sharks, what do you feel like?
Like a rhinestone cowboy.
And finally, in part one of our two-parter, albums. I'm not including the John Lennon ones. There's 2 John Lennon albums that came out this year. Neither of which, in fact, were albums of new John Lennon songs, but we'll get to all that in part 2. But some real biggies here. I'd say there's 3, maybe 4 biggies here from my perspective. Blood on the Tracks by Bob Dylan could very easily have a claim as his best album. Very personal, of course. He was going through a breakup which ended in divorce from his wife, Sarah. Physical Graffiti by Led Zeppelin. I particularly love, there's a few songs I really love from that album, but I love the Bronny Orr, the instrumental.
Jimmy Page.
And in the Song Remains the Same film, memory serves me rightly, I haven't seen that for a long time, they play that over, I think it's shots of New York City, is it? And yeah, it's a beautiful piece of music. Of course, they have other much more famous songs on that. It was a double album by Zeppelin. And then we've got Young Americans, David Bowie, which featured the song Fame, the aforementioned. Also featured Bowie's cover of Across the Universe, which John played, I think, rhythm guitar. And it's also got the song, of course, Young Americans. That was another reinvention by Mr. Bowie, who really is. I mean, if you're not a big David Bowie fan, but you like rock music, it's just worth investigating because it's just the gift that keeps giving his music. And the number of reinventions that didn't seem too forced just because he was the rock chameleon. That's a great album anyway. Tonight's the Night by Neil Young. I think he brought out also the album Zuma, which I'm not sure if I've heard or not, but Tonight's the Night. It's a great Neil Young album. Night at the Opera by Queen, of course, featuring Bohemian Rhapsody, and The Basement Tapes. That's a strange one because I always think of that as 1967, particularly having bought the official bootleg in the Bob Dylan bootleg series. I just don't think of that as a 75 album, but it did come out this year. I'm just going to bosh through the rest of these fairly quickly. So Beatles Connection, Wings, brought out Venus and Mars. I really don't think that's a great album. I've listened through it a few times. It had a few songs that really worked well live. You know, when they were touring in 76, I mean, they were just a kick-ass band at that point. And that album will be mentioned in part 2. Again, Lennon fans, Beatles fans will know the connection. an event that almost happened but didn't quite. George Harrison brought out Extra Texture, Read All About It. I don't think I've heard that album, but let me recommend former guest and friend of mine, Owen Ling's book, George Harrison in the 70s. I'll put that in the show notes. Now, this album included a song called This Guitar Can't Keep From Crying, which was a kind of a sequel to While My Guitar Gently Weeps. We got Born to Run. We mentioned the single already. This is obviously the album from Springsteen. The Who by Numbers. We got Horses by Patti Smith. Toys in the Attic by Aerosmith. You've got the live album by Bob Marley, which includes the incredible performance, which is the performance of No Woman, No Cry. I didn't hear the studio version for years, and the studio version is not bad, but it just pales in comparison to the live version. I had that album, Legend, a great compilation album, before I had any of Marley's studio albums. Just fantastic. Two Sides of the Moon, again a Beatles connection, because on that album there are covers by Keith Moon of Move Over Miss L, which was a John Lennon B-side in 1975. We'll get to that in part 2. And also In My Life. Let's hear a little bit of those two covers.
About them in my life, I love you more.
ABBA brought out their third album, eponymous album, with Mamma Mia and SOS on it. ABBA is another band where in the days where you could only listen to music by buying CDs or vinyl or buying the albums, essentially. I was thinking I probably wouldn't have bought an ABBA album, but just as you could say that David Bowie or Elton John were the Beatles of the 70s in terms of their fame and some of the artistic breakthroughs they made, particularly Bowie, I'd say. ABBA were the 70s version of the early Beatles. You know, they were doing what the Beatles used to do, creating these incredibly catchy songs that you just couldn't help sing along with. They were earworms, if you like. I think earworm has a slightly negative connotation. And maybe with ABBA, you know, it's one of those things where you might find them a bit cheesy, a bit kitsch, but you can't not remember hearing Mamma Mia or SOS or Waterloo once you've heard it. They were obviously known as quite a wholesome band, and the Beatles had that image in the early 60s, even though what was going on behind the scenes, certainly for the Beatles and quite possibly with ABBA, was a different story. You got Diamonds and Rust by Joan Baez, which included a cover of Dylan's Simple Twist of Fate, which was on Blood on the Tracks, the album I mentioned earlier. Joan Baez had kind of hooked back up with Dylan, I don't think romantically, but Dylan had asked her to participate in the Rolling Thunder review, and let me massively recommend the Netflix documentary on that. Really good. Frank Zappa brought out 2 albums. Bit of a lean year for Frank, only 2 albums, One Size Fits All and Bongo Fury. The second of those was with Captain Beefheart. I haven't heard that album. Beefheart, it's one of those things where people say you've got to listen to it a few times to get it, and that's true of Frank Zappa, but I found Beefheart even harder to get into than I did Zappa. Still crazy after all these years. I'll put in the show notes a clip of Paul Simon on the Dick Cavett show when he was busy writing that song, and he'd written about half of it, and it's just fabulous to hear him playing that. It's one of those things, a bit like maybe All Things Must Pass, the George Harrison, where I actually almost prefer the stripped-down version to the final production. Fleetwood Mac, eponymous album that included Landslide, which was covered by the Smashing Pumpkins in the 90s. Just two more, Michael Jackson's Best Of, so that was collating all the stuff he'd done until then. Of course, this is years before Thriller and years before he bought the Beatles songs, of course. And then finally, last and quite possibly least, Metal Machine Music, double album by Lou Reed. If you've never heard of this, again, it's on YouTube. It's, I don't know what to say about it, really. It's designed to be completely unlistenable. See if you can get through that album. And that's it. That's the end of part one. And I'll be back next month, just before Christmas, to cover the John Lennon events with a bit of Beatles involvement. If you'd like to help out the show, really you're helping out my work across Glass Onion on John Lennon, Life and Life Only and Film Gold. There are PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee links in the show notes. In both cases you can make a one-off donation. There's no subscription involved. Thank you very much for listening, everybody, and I'll see you in December. Take care and goodbye.
Take this, brother. May it serve you well.